They laughed when I dug under my own floor. Then winter came for their children.
January 9th, 1877. The thermometer outside the Holsworth cabin read 31 degrees below zero, and it was still falling. Silas Holsworth sat in the chair by the wood stove, the same chair he had occupied for most of the past 9 months, and watched the fire. Not tended it, just watched it. The flames moved through dry wood the way a man works when he has been doing something long enough that the motion and the purpose have become the same thing. Outside, the wind had been running hard for 6 hours, and somewhere to the north past the tree line, he could hear it finding the gaps in Clifton Jameson's barn. He looked down at the floor, at the braided rug his wife had placed over the trapdoor in the kitchen, the same trapdoor he had told her not to build in the same floor he had raised on fieldstone pillars the previous autumn, because he knew Montana ground moved in winter, and a man who built on bare earth was a fool. He had been right about the pillars. He had been wrong about almost everything else. He thought about what he had said to her in May, 8 months ago. The words came back to him the way bad decisions always come back, not all at once, but in pieces, each one sharper than the last. This is my land. I built this cabin. You will wait until I can do it properly. He stared at the fire a while longer. Then he pulled the rug back with his boot, lifted the trapdoor, and felt the dry, cool air rise from below like a breath the earth had been holding all summer. 8 months earlier, April of 1876. The horse was a gray gelding named Porter, 15 years old, and generally steady, and he spooked at a ground squirrel that came out of the grass at exactly the wrong moment. Silas was stepping down from the wagon. The horse went left. Silas went straight. He heard the crack before he felt it, a sound like green timber splitting, and then the ground came up fast. Dorothea was in the garden 40 yards away. She covered those 40 yards in what seemed like no time at all, and by the time she reached him, she had already made the assessment that would save his leg. He could see it in her face the way she went still for 1 second before she started moving with purpose. She had seen something in the angle of his leg and understood it immediately the way a carpenter understands a joint that has failed. She sent Kester to the barn for 2 straight pieces of lath. She tore a length of cloth from her apron without hesitation. She positioned the bones with her hands, and Silas gripped the wagon wheel and did not make a sound because his wife needed quiet to work, and he understood that much at least. Dr. Hadley Greer arrived 3 days later, having ridden 60 miles from Missoula on a horse that looked nearly as tired as the doctor himself. He was a lean man in his 50s, economical, with words and movement, the kind of man who had seen enough frontier injuries to know immediately which ones were going to end well and which were not. He examined the leg for a long time without speaking. He moved his hands along the bone. He asked Silas to flex where he could and to hold still where he could not. Finally, he straightened up and looked at Dorothea. If you had not done this immediately, he said, the break would have shifted. The bone could have come through the skin. At that point, we would have been discussing amputation. He said it plainly the way a man reports weather. Silas said nothing. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin he had built with his own hands. The ceiling he had carefully fitted with tongue and groove pine boards, so Dorothea would have a proper surface above her head instead of rough timber, and he felt something move through him that he did not have a name for yet. Dorothea said, how long before he can work? Dr. Greer said late summer, if he rests. He looked at Silas when he said the word rests, and the weight he put on it was unmistakable. After the doctor left, the cabin was quiet for a while. The children were outside. Silas could see Dorothea through the window, standing at the edge of the garden, with her back to him, looking at the sky. He had been watching her a great deal through that window in the days since the accident. It was the only direction his attention could move freely. He thought about the winter. He thought about the wood pile, 2 cords stacked against the north wall, already spoken for by November. He thought about what Dr. Greer had said and what he had not said, which was that a Montana winter would not pause to accommodate a man's broken leg or his plans to fix things properly when he was able. He thought about the space beneath the floor. He had chosen to elevate the cabin on stone pillars rather than build directly on the earth, a decision any experienced carpenter would have made. Soil moved. Frost crept in. Timber rotted when it sat in contact with ground that held moisture through 8 months of the year. The 18-inch gap between the floorboards and the earth had been correct engineering, simple and sensible, and he had thought nothing more about it than that. Dorothea came back inside. She washed her hands at the basin. She did not look at him immediately, which meant she was organizing what she was about to say. I want to excavate under the house, she said. Silas looked at her. The space is already there, she said. The pillars are stone. The soil is clay. I can see it where the ground slopes at the north edge. Clay holds its shape. If I dig a chamber beneath the main room, supported by the existing pillars, I can store the winter's firewood below the floor. It stays dry. It stays at ground temperature, which means no freezing, no thawing, no moisture cycling. We would never need to worry about the wood pile again. She was using the language her father had used. Silas had heard it before, the precise vocabulary of a man who spent his life thinking about materials and forces and the way things failed. Her father had been a ship's carpenter in Philadelphia, and he had died in 1872, and he had left behind 3 notebooks of technical observations that Dorothea kept wrapped in oilcloth in the cedar chest. Silas had never read them. He understood enough to know they were beyond him. "This is my foundation," Silas said. "Those pillars are holding up your kitchen floor." "I know what they're holding," she said. "I'll work around them, 3 feet of clearance on every side. I'll reinforce the bases as I go. I've read what my father wrote about cargo hold construction, the way moisture moves through enclosed spaces, the way you manage it with airflow rather than fighting it." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You want to dig a hole under our house," he said. "I want to build a storage chamber that will keep 4 cords of firewood dry through the worst winter this territory can produce." He was aware of his leg. He was aware of the chair. He was aware that he was sitting while she stood, and that this arrangement was going to persist for months regardless of what either of them wanted. "This is my land," he said. "I built this cabin. I know what that foundation can hold. When my leg is healed, I'll do it properly." Dorothea looked at him. Not with anger, not with the particular expression he had sometimes seen on women's faces when their husbands said something that required patience to absorb. She looked at him with that 1 second of absolute stillness before the practical assessment began. "Silas," she said, "the winter will be here before your leg is healed. You know that." He did not answer. She put on her work coat and went outside. The next morning, Silas heard the sound of a short-handled spade working against the earth beneath the floorboards. 3 weeks into May, Clifton Jameson stopped by to check on the situation. Clifton had homesteaded in the Clearwater Valley since 1868, and he had earned his opinions the hard way. He had buried his first wife in the winter of 1873 pneumonia, and he had never remarried, and the experience had left him with a particular attention to the ways that frontier optimism could kill people who should have known better. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had paid tuition in grief and felt entitled to pass on what he had learned. He found Dorothea coming out from under the cabin, her dress gray with clay dust, a bucket of dark soil in each hand. She had rigged a rope and pulley system from one of the floor joists, and Kester was hauling buckets up from below while she dug. It was efficient. Clifton noticed that before he noticed anything else. He stepped down from his horse and said what he had come to say. "That foundation is holding your kitchen floor," he said. "You start pulling soil from underneath those pillars, and one good frost heave will crack your walls. I've seen it happen to better-built structures than this one." Dorothea set down her buckets. "The pillar bases are sitting on hard-pan clay," she said. "I'm leaving 3 feet of clearance around every one of them and widening the stone base as I go to distribute the load across a larger surface or area. The design accounts for lateral movement." Clifton looked at her the way a man looks at a forecast he doesn't trust. "And even if the structure holds, that space will fill with moisture," he said. "Wood stored underground will rot before Christmas." "I'm putting in 2 ventilation shafts," she said. "One on the upslope side, one on the downslope side. The ground stays warmer than the outside air through the winter, which creates a pressure differential. Cool air enters from the upslope shaft, and the temperature difference pushes the moisture carrying air out through the downslope shaft. The system runs continuously without any mechanical assistance. My father designed cargo holds on sailing ships using the same principle." Clifton was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the window where Silas was sitting. "Silas," he said, "come on now." Silas looked back at him from the window. He was doing it with his eyes rather than his voice. Clifton understood, because Dorothea was standing right there, and Silas Holsworth was not a man who allowed his disagreements with his wife to become public entertainment. But the look said clearly enough, "I have already had this conversation, and it did not go the way I hoped." Clifton looked back at Dorothea. "You could build a proper storage shed," he said. "I can spare some lumber. The Harrisons might help with the framing." "I appreciate that," Dorothea said, but I need something that will work in 40 below zero, not something that will work in normal winters. Clifton got back on his horse. He looked down at her, at the bucket of dark clay soil she had set at her feet, at the rope and pulley system her 12-year-old son was operating with practiced efficiency. He had a thought that he did not say out loud, which was that the woman in front of him had clearly been planning this for some time and had no intention of being talked out of it by anyone, including the man in the window. He rode away with the intention of checking back in the fall. He was fairly certain he would find either a sinkhole where the cabin used to be, or, and this possibility annoyed him more than he expected, a working underground storage chamber that he had failed to predict. On the way home, Clifton stopped at the edge of the Holsworth property and sat on his horse for a moment, looking back at the cabin. He thought about his own woodpile. It was adequate. Probably adequate. He had been telling himself it was adequate since March. 2 weeks after Clifton's visit, Forrest Englehart came to discuss a timber contract with Silas. Englehart had been building structures across this part of Montana since 1856, and his knowledge was architectural and specifics earned through 17 completed buildings and the failures embedded inside several of them. He was a methodical man with large hands, in a habit of standing very still when he was working something out in his head, which made people who did not know him think he had stopped listening. He had not stopped listening. He found Dorothea emerging from under the cabin in the same condition as before. Clay gray, purposeful, unembarrassed. She set down her bucket and looked at him without waiting to be addressed. Englehart studied this pillar arrangement visible through the gap. "You're creating a root cellar under your living space," he said. "What are you doing for the floor joists?" "Leaving them in place, working between them. The existing structure stays intact." "And moisture," he said. "Wood stored underground will reabsorb moisture even after seasoning." Dorothy explained the ventilation system. She was precise. She used her father's terminology and her father's logic, and Englehart listened the way a craftsman listens to another craftsman, following the reasoning rather than judging the conclusion. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I've seen this principle in ship construction," he said, "but a ship's hold is sealed against the outside environment. You're working with bare earth walls in Montana weather. The clay seals better than timber in high moisture conditions," Dorothea said. "It's counterintuitive, but it's why earthen vessels were used for storage long before wood was available. The clay walls will reduce moisture transfer rather than increase it." Englehart squatted and looked into the darkness under the floor. "Maybe," he said finally. He straightened up and walked to his horse. Before he mounted, he took a small instrument from his saddlebag and set it on the porch railing. Dorothea looked at it. It was a wood moisture gauge, a simple device with 2 brass probes and a numbered dial. She had seen one before in her father's workshop. Englehart did not explain it. He got on his horse and said he would be back in the fall and rode away. Dorothea picked up the gauge and held it in both hands. She understood what it was and what it meant. It was not a gift. It was a wager. Come autumn, Englehart intended to press those probes into her stored firewood and read the number on the dial, and that number would tell him everything that arguments and explanations could not. She put the gauge in her apron pocket. Silas watched from the window. After Englehart's horse disappeared past the tree line, he said, "What did he leave you?" "A measuring device," Dorothea said. "What does it measure?" "Whether I'm right." That evening, after the children had eaten and gone to bed, Dorothea was sitting at the kitchen table with her father's second notebook open in front of her. The notebook was worn at the spine, the pages dense with her father's precise handwriting, diagrams crowding the margins. She had been working through the section on convection management in enclosed cargo spaces. Silas watched her from his chair. She was on the 3rd page of the section when something fell out of the binding, a single sheet of paper folded twice. She picked it up. Her father's handwriting on the outside, her name, in the careful block letters he used when he was writing something he wanted her to be able to read clearly. She looked at it for a moment, then she folded it again and tucked it between the pages she had already read. Silas said, "What's that?" "A note from my father." She closed the notebook over it. "I'll read it when the work is done." He looked at her. "You're not going to read it now." "No," she said. "I don't want it to change anything while I'm still in the middle of deciding." She picked up the notebook again and went back to the ventilation diagrams. Silas sat with A for a while. He thought about the kind of discipline it took to set aside something your dead father had left you specifically for moments of uncertainty and deliberately not open it until you had already proven something to yourself. He thought about that more carefully than he had thought about anything in a long time. The digging continued through June. Dorothea worked in 2-hour shifts, crawling into the darkness under the house with her coal oil lantern and her short-handled spade, filling bucket after bucket with dark Montana clay and hauling it up through the trap door to where Kester waited to carry it away. The excavated soil went to build up the drainage swale on the downslope side of the cabin, reshaping the land slightly to encourage water to move away from the foundation rather than toward it. On the 6th day of digging, Dorothea came up through the trap door with a different expression. She sat on the kitchen floor for a moment without speaking. Silas waited. He had learned to wait. "One of your pillars is not perfectly vertical," she said. "The one in the northwest corner. It's leaning approximately 3 degrees toward the north wall." Silas was quiet. "It's not dangerous in its current state," she said, "but if I excavate too close to the base, I risk increasing the lateral stress on the foundation." He thought about the northwest corner. He thought about the afternoon he had set that pillar in September of 1875, when the light was going flat and he had been pushing to finish before dark. He remembered being satisfied with it. He remembered not going back to check. "The base needs to be widened," he said. "Add stone to the perimeter at the base 6 inches on each side, overlapping the existing foundation stones, so the new material is keyed into the old. Spread the load across a wider surface, and the 3-degree lean becomes irrelevant." Dorothea looked at him. "I built that cabin," he said. "I know each one of those pillars." She nodded slowly. He said, "I'll draw you the pattern." He got his pencil and his straight edge from the shelf beside the window, the same tools he had used to plan the cabin itself, and he drew her a diagram on the back of a feed store receipt. Foundation stone placement and overlap pattern, the geometry of load distribution. He had not held a pencil with purpose in 6 weeks, and the act of it moved through him in a way that had nothing to do with the leg. Dorothea took the diagram, looked at it carefully, and went back down through the trap door. From his chair, Silas listened to the sound of her working, the rhythm of the spade, the scrape of stone on stone as she placed the additional foundation material. He placed himself in the northwest corner of that unfinished space in the dark, with the lantern doing the work his hands understood and his leg would not let him do. The summer moved that way. Dorothea dug, Kester hauled, Silas drew diagrams and offered calculations from his chair, and Dorothea implemented them without comment or ceremony, which was the clearest form of trust he knew how to recognize. Dr. Greer returned in early July for a follow-up examination. He pressed along the length of the healing bone and asked Silas to bear weight on it briefly, then told him to sit back down. The bone was knitting correctly. Another 6 weeks of careful use. Another 2 months before full weight bearing was advisable. Before he left, Dr. Greer sat at the table and drank the coffee Dorothea offered him. He looked at the trap door. He looked at Dorothea. "I heard in Stevensville that Mrs. Blackthorne has been asking about your project," he said. Dorothea turned from the stove. "Matilda Blackthorne." Dr. Greer looked at his coffee. "She was asking whether anyone with building experience had formally assessed the structural soundness." Silas said whether she was asking about the structure or about the likelihood of failure. Dr. Greer did not answer immediately. Then he said the winter of 1871 saw temperatures reach 38 below and hold for 31 consecutive days. "There are people in this valley who remember it." He paused. "There are also people who say this winter will be worse." He put on his hat and left. Dorothea stood at the window after his horse was gone. Silas watched her. She said Matilda Blackthorne has 480 acres and a full-time hired hand to manage her wood supply. "She has no reason to concern herself with our project." Silas said nothing. Dorothea turned from the window. "Unless she has a reason we haven't identified yet." She went back to the kitchen, and Silas sat in his chair, and neither of them said anything more about Matilda Blackthorne that evening. But both of them were thinking about her, and both of them understood that an interested neighbor with resources and opinions and influence over a dozen other families was a variable that a structural diagram could not account for. Outside, the sky was turning the particular shade of iron gray that meant the temperature would drop overnight. It was July. The summer in the Clearwater Valley was already thinking about its exit. And below the kitchen floor in the dark, and the clay-scented quiet, the chamber that would determine the winter was still only half finished. The heat of the Clearwater Valley in late July was the kind that pressed down from above and rose from below, at the same time trapping a person in the middle of it like something caught between two hands. Dorothea had been working in that heat since before sunrise, and by mid-morning her shirt was dark across the shoulders and her hands had stopped feeling the handle of the spade individually. They had become part of it. 47 buckets on Monday, 43 on Tuesday when the temperature reached 94, and she had to stop twice to sit in the shade of the cabin's north wall and drink from the ceramic jug Kester kept refilling from the creek. 49 on Wednesday, which was the day she found the piece of pottery. She was working in the southeast corner of the chamber, deepening the floor to create the slight downhill slope that would encourage any water intrusion to move toward the drainage shaft rather than pool in the center. The spade caught on something that did not give the way clay gives. She set the spade aside and used her hands. It was a curved fragment, maybe 4 inches across reddish-brown, with a faint pattern pressed into the outer surface before firing. Old. Not old the way a discarded tool was old. Old the way the land itself was old. Kester was at the top of the shaft waiting for the next bucket. She heard him shift his weight on the floorboards above her. She turned the fragment over in her hands. She thought about what it meant to be digging in ground that had been used before by people who had solved their own problems of survival in their own ways, and who had left this small evidence of their presence in the clay. She placed the fragment carefully on the ledge beside her lantern. Then she picked up the spade and went back to work. When she came up at noon, Kester asked her what she had found. She showed him. He held it with both hands the way children hold things they understand are serious. She said, "We keep it." He nodded and set it on the kitchen windowsill. Silas looked at it from his chair but did not ask. He understood from the way Dorothea had come up through the trapdoor quietly and without her usual efficiency that what she had found was something she was still thinking about. He let her think. By the first week of August, the chamber was finished. 7 feet wide, 12 feet long, 5 feet 2 inches at the deepest point. The floor sloped 8 degrees toward the downslope drainage shaft. The walls were smooth clay. The 2 stone-lined ventilation shafts ran exactly as planned. Dorothea tested the airflow by suspending a damp cloth in the center of the chamber and leaving it for 3 days. When she retrieved it, it was completely dry. She noted the result in the back of her father's second notebook, in the margin beside his ventilation diagrams, in her own handwriting alongside his. The trapdoor took her 4 days to build. Pine boards from packing crates planed smooth, a layer of wool batting between 2 outer faces. Leather stripping along every edge for the seal. When finished, it weighed 37 pounds and created a pressure differential strong enough that opening it required deliberate effort. She placed it in the kitchen floor and positioned the table over it and laid the braided rug on top of that. Unless you knew what you were looking for, there was nothing to see. Silas came and stood over it when she was done. He pressed on the rug with the toe of his boot and felt a solid resistance underneath. He said nothing, but he did not go back to his chair immediately. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, and Dorothea, who was washing her hands at the basin, did not turn around, and both of them allowed the moment to exist without being named. Then Kane Jameson appeared at the door. He was 14 Clifton's son, and he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and neither his father's certainty nor his mother's patience, which left him in the particular position of a young person who sees clearly what is happening around him and has not yet learned to pretend otherwise. He said, "Mrs. Holsworth, I came to help with the wood hauling, if that's all right." Dorothea looked at him. "Your father knows you're here." He looked at the floor briefly. "No, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Kester can show you where we're working. The handcart is in the barn." What followed was 3 hours of the most efficient wood hauling the Holsworth property had seen since Silas's accident. Kane worked without instruction and without complaint, and Kester matched his pace, and Dorothea split lodgepole pine in the clearing on the western edge of the property, while the boys moved the cut wood to the stack near the trapdoor. The rhythm of it was satisfying in a way that purely solitary work was not. She was setting up a new round on the chopping block when she became aware that Silas was watching from the window again. She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Kane, then back at her. She picked up the axe. The wood split clean. Clifton Jameson arrived 2 days later. He came in the early afternoon, which was not his usual time for visiting, and he tied his horse at the post with the deliberate movements of a man who has been rehearsing what he intends to say. He found Silas on the porch. Dorothea was in the woodlot, audible but not visible. Kester was in the garden. Clifton said, "I know Kane has been coming here." Silas said he has. Clifton looked at the tree line where the sound of the axe was coming from. "I want to know what you think about it." Silas was quiet for a moment. He said, I think your son is a smart kid who made his own decision. And I think if you ride over there and tell him he made the wrong one, he's going to spend the next 10 years wondering why his father was afraid of being wrong. Clifton looked at him. It wasn't a gentle thing to say, and both men knew it. Clifton said, I'm not afraid of being wrong. Silas said, then you won't mind if he keeps coming. The two men looked at each other in the particular way that men who have known each other a long time look at each other when they have reached the outer edge of what can be settled comfortably. Then Clifton untied his horse and rode back toward his own property without another word. Kane was back the following week. Clifton knew he did not come again to say anything about it. Kezia Halford arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, the week the chamber was fully stocked and the trapdoor was in daily use. She came with her husband Patrick, and she sat down at Dorothea's kitchen table with the manner of a woman who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was time to say it out loud. Patrick took a seat near the wall without drawing attention to himself. He had been a railroad worker for 8 years, and he had the hands and the posture that came with it. Kezia said, I've been hearing about what you've built here. I want to understand why you built it the way you did. Dorothea poured coffee. She sat across the table. You could have built a storage shed, Kezia said. With help from the Jameson boys and some borrowed lumber, you could have had something up in 2 weeks. Instead, you spent 3 months digging a hole under your own house with your 12-year-old son. Dorothea said a shed above ground is subject to everything above ground. Temperature swings, wind, ice loading on the roof, moisture cycling through the boards. Underground doesn't move that way. Patrick spoke from his seat near the wall. And you did this yourself. Dorothea looked at him. With Kester's help, she said, and Silas's. Silas said from across the room, I drew a diagram for a foundation repair. That was the extent of my contribution. Patrick looked between them. He said, Mrs. Holsworth, I'm not questioning your ability. I'm asking whether it was worth the risk. Kezia said what Patrick means is that we've lost people in this valley to ideas that seemed sound in July and failed in January. Dorothea looked at Kezia for a moment. She said, if I don't do this and the winter is as bad as Dr. Greer thinks it will be, my family burns through wet wood from a frozen pile and prays the chimney doesn't catch fire from the creosote buildup. That is also a risk. I chose which risk I was willing to take. Silas answered from across the room before Dorothea could continue. He said the economics are straightforward. We couldn't afford the lumber for a shed. The ground under this cabin was already there. The labor was Dorothea's to give or not give. There was no equivalent alternative that we could actually afford. Kezia looked at Silas. Then she looked at Dorothea. She said, that's the first time I've heard him explain your project. Dorothea said it's the first time he has. The room was quiet for a moment. Kezia said, I owe you an apology. Not for the question. For how long it took me to come ask it in person instead of talking about it with people who weren't you. She left an hour later without promising anything. But 2 weeks after that, she appeared at the door with a loaf of bread still warm from her oven, and she did not explain why, and Dorothea did not ask. Reverend Yardley Everhart arrived in September on the circuit route that took him across 4 settlements every 6 weeks. He was a Pennsylvania man, educated and sincere, and he carried into the frontier the genuine conviction that the structures of civilization, including the structures of proper gender conduct, were what separated human society from the chaos that surrounded it on every side. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who confused the customs of one place and time for the laws of nature itself. He found Dorothea in the woodlot splitting pine rounds, while Silas sat nearby in a camp chair Dorothea had moved outside so he could have some air during the days she was working within earshot. Reverend Everhart took in the scene and said, Mrs. Holsworth, surely there are men in this valley who could assist with this kind of labor. Dorothea set the axe down. My husband broke his leg 4 months ago, she said. I'm capable of swinging an axe. Everhart said, I don't question your capability, but there's a natural order in these matters. Men provide the heavy labor. Women manage the household. When we set that order aside, we invite disharmony into family life. Silas stood up. He had not stood up quickly since April. His leg allowed it now carefully with some planning in the movement. But he stood and he looked at Reverend Everhart and he said, Reverend, I built this cabin. I chose every stone in that foundation and fit every board in that floor. My wife is currently using the space I built and the knowledge she inherited from her father to make sure our children survive the winter. I don't see where the disorder is. Everhart looked at him. Then he looked at Dorothea. Then he said, Silas, I'm speaking to the broader principle. Silas said the broader principle is that the work that needs doing gets done by whoever can do it. My wife can do this work. I cannot right now. That seems like exactly the right order to me. Everhart left shortly after. He rode in the direction of the Blackthorn property, which was 4 miles east on the road to Stevensville. Dorothea watched him go. She said to Silas, "You didn't have to do that." Silas said, "Yes, I did." She picked up the axe. He sat back down. Neither of them said anything more, but the quality of the silence between them had changed, and both of them felt it. By late September, Dorothea had split and hauled 4.5 cords of lodgepole pine. The excess half cord went into a traditional stack outside as backup. The rest went through the trap door, and Kester stacked it in the systematic pattern they had developed together over the summer rows, oriented to allow air movement between individual pieces while using every cubic foot of available space. The chamber held more than Dorothea had calculated. When the last piece was in place and the trapdoor was closed and the rug was laid back over it, the kitchen looked exactly as it had in the spring before any of it began. Matilda Blackthorn came on a Thursday morning at the end of September, and she did not come alone. She brought Vera Harrison, whose husband owned the second largest property in the valley, and she sat down at Dorothea's table with the particular composure of a woman who has thought carefully about what she is about to do and has decided that the discomfort of doing it is less than the discomfort of not doing it. Dorothea offered coffee. Matilda accepted it. Vera held hers without drinking. Matilda said, "Dorothea, I'm going to speak plainly because I think you prefer that." Dorothea said, "I do." Matilda said, "There are families in this valley who are concerned, not about your safety, about what it means when a woman undertakes a project of this kind without the visible involvement of her husband. It raises questions about the Holsworth household that I don't believe you intend to raise. There's a simple solution. Clifton Jameson or Forrest Englehart could be named as the primary builders on this project going forward. The work is yours. The credit goes to them. Everyone understands what actually happened, and the questions go away." Dorothea set down her cup. She looked at Matilda for a long moment, long enough that Vera shifted in her chair. She said, "The work is done, Mrs. Blackthorn. It has been done for 3 weeks. The chamber is full, the trapdoor is sealed, and the design is complete. There is nothing to name anyone as the builder of because the building is finished, and the person who built it was me." Matilda said, Dorothea. Dorothea said, "I understand what you're asking and why you're asking it. And I understand that you believe you're doing me a favor, but what you're describing is asking me to remove my own name from something I built with my hands while my husband sat in a chair and drew one diagram. I'm not willing to do that." Matilda looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but contained elements of both. Vera Harrison put down her coffee cup without having drunk from it. She stood up. She said to Dorothea very quietly, "I'm sorry for coming here." She walked out the door. Matilda sat for a moment longer, then stood as well, smoothing her skirt in the gesture of a woman reassembling her composure. She said at the door, "When this winter tests your design, Dorothea, I hope it holds." It was the most honest thing Matilda had said in the entire conversation. Dorothea recognized that. She said, "So do I." That evening, after the children were in bed, Dorothea sat at the table and told Silas about the visit. She told it plainly without performance, the way she reported any factual situation that required a decision. Silas listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "What did she offer you if you had agreed?" Dorothea said she didn't say specifically, but the implication was that winter in this valley would be easier, socially. Silas said, "And if you refused?" Dorothea said, "Then I'm not allowed to be wrong." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you wrong?" Dorothea said, "No." Silas nodded. He said, "Then that's settled." He did not say anything else about Matilda Blackthorn that night, but Dorothea noticed that he moved his chair slightly closer to the window before he went to bed, the way a man positions himself when he has decided to pay closer attention to what is happening outside. October arrived and brought the first real test. A storm came out of the northwest on the 12th, dropping temperatures from 56 degrees to 22 degrees in 6 hours. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow, and the valley accumulated 14 inches before the storm moved east. The external wood pile, even under the roof overhang, became encased. The logs were coated in a shell of ice that required a hatchet to break open, and the snow between the stacked pieces had compressed into something closer to mortar than to powder. Dorothea lifted the trapdoor on the morning after the storm. Below her, in the 52-degree air of the chamber, the firewood was exactly as she had left it. Dry, light in the hand, separating easily from the stack without the frozen adhesion that was making every other family in the valley chip and curse at their wood piles in the gray October morning. She loaded her arms and climbed back up. She fed the stove. The fire caught in under a minute, and the heat came up quickly and evenly without the sputtering and smoke that came from burning wood that had absorbed moisture from a week of temperature cycling. Clifton Jameson came by that morning. His own pile was ice-locked, and he had spent an hour freeing enough wood for the day's burning. He had clay on his boots from where he'd been digging at the frozen base of his stack. Dorothea showed him down through the trapdoor without preamble. He descended into the chamber with the lantern she handed him. He stood among the stacked rows of dry pine for a long moment, moving the light slowly across the walls, the ceiling, the ventilation shafts. He pressed his palm against the clay wall and held it there. He came back up. He said, "Well, I'll be damned." Silas from the window said, "Probably." But not because of the firewood. Clifton looked at him, then at Dorothea. Then something shifted in his face, not quite an apology and not quite admiration, but something in the territory between them. He said, "My place, the soil. You mentioned clay." Dorothea said, "Your drainage pattern suggests clay from the northwest corner of your property through to the creek bank. I can look at it properly in spring." Clifton stood there for a moment. He said, "My wood pile is only good through February. Kane told me a month ago. I already knew before I told him I didn't want him coming here." Dorothea did not say anything to that. Clifton said, "I wasn't coming to watch you fail, Mrs. Holsworth. I was coming to learn how you did it." He rode home with the look of a man who has settled something internal that had been unsettled for a long time. 3 days later, Forrest Englehart arrived from Missoula. He went through the trapdoor with his own lantern and the wood moisture gauge that Dorothea had kept in her apron pocket since June. He pressed the twin probes into a piece of lodgepole pine that had been in the chamber since September. He looked at the dial, he looked at Dorothea, he looked at the dial again. 14% moisture content. He set the gauge down on the earthen floor of the chamber and straightened up slowly. He looked at the ventilation shafts. He looked at the sealed clay walls. He looked at the joists above his head, showing no signs of the moisture damage he had predicted in June. He said, "I've built 17 structures in Montana Territory." He paused. "This is the most intelligent piece of practical engineering I've seen in any of them." Dorothea said nothing. Englehart said, "You understand what you did here, don't you? You didn't fight the environment. You read it. The slope, the clay, the prevailing wind direction. You used all of it." Dorothea said, "My father taught me that fighting a system costs more than understanding it." Englehart picked up the moisture gauge and climbed back up through the trap door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the ordinary surface of the room that had something extraordinary underneath it. He said, "I'm going to need timber contracts through the spring. More volume than I discussed with Silas." Dorothea said, "I'll tell him." Englehart put on his hat. Before he went out the door, he turned and said the gauge. "Keep it." Then he left. Dorothea stood in the kitchen. Outside, the November sky had taken on the particular density that old-timers in the valley described as the sky loading itself, gathering weight before it let something down. The thermometer on the porch post read 18 degrees, and it was not yet noon. She lifted the edge of the braided rug with her boot and looked at the outline of the trap door beneath it. Then she went to the window and looked north toward the tree line, toward the ridge line beyond that, toward whatever was building itself up there in the iron-colored sky. Dr. Greer had said this winter would be worse than 1871. She thought about what she had done and whether it was enough, and then she decided in the practical way she decided most things that the question was no longer useful. The chamber was full, the wood was dry, the design was sound. What came next was not hers to control, only hers to survive. And somewhere out there in that loading sky, January was already on its way. The cold arrived the way serious things always arrive, not with announcement, but with a quality of permanence that made everything before it seem like rehearsal. November had been a warning. December was the thing itself. By the third week of December, the temperature in the Clearwater Valley had not risen above zero in 11 days, and the families who had planned for a normal winter were already making adjustments they had not intended to make. Wood consumption was running 30% higher than projected because the cold found every gap in every wall and worked at it continuously, and a fire that would have held a cabin comfortable in an ordinary year was barely keeping the frost off the interior walls in this one. Dorothea descended through the trapdoor each morning at first light. She selected the day's wood by feel in the darkness before she lit the lantern, choosing pieces by weight and texture, the way her father had chosen timber for hull planking by what her hands told her rather than what her eyes could confirm. She carried 4 pieces up at a time. The fire caught quickly every morning, and the cabin held its heat through the day, with a steadiness that Silas had begun to rely on without remarking about it the way a man relies on anything that simply works. She noticed things that winter that she had not thought to anticipate. The children slept differently, more deeply, without the half-waking that comes from a body monitoring its own temperature through the night. Josie stopped wearing her coat inside the house, which she had done every winter Dorothea could remember. Kester developed the habit of doing his arithmetic lessons at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, drawn by the consistent warmth that radiated from the stove rather than the uncertain heat of the bedroom where he usually worked. Silas noticed these things too. Dorothea could tell by the way he watched the children with a particular attention that was different from his usual parental awareness. He was cataloging something. The first chimney fire in the valley happened on December 28th. It was at the Brennan place 3 miles north, and the creosote that had been building in their flue since October finally ignited at 2 in the morning. They lost the upper section of the chimney and a portion of the roof above it. Nobody died. The family spent 4 days with the Harrisons, while Patrick Halford and 2 other men helped with repairs, working in temperatures that made every tool handle feel like it had been stored overnight in a river. The second fire happened on January 4th. A family Dorothea did not know well, recent arrivals from Ohio. Their name was Croft. They lost more than the Brennans had. The fire moved faster because the roof timbers were green, cut from living trees the previous summer, in the rush to get the cabin built before snow came. By the time anyone arrived to help, there was nothing to save. Dorothea heard about it from Dr. Greer, who came through on January 7th, looking like a man who had not slept in a week because he had not slept in a week. He sat at her table and drank 2 cups of coffee in succession and did not speak for several minutes. Then he said the Croft family is at the Jameson place. Clifton took them in. He has room and he has enough wood, barely, but enough. Dorothea said, "How are they?" Dr. Greer said, cold, frightened. "The youngest child has frostbite on 2 toes, mild, it will heal." He paused. "I've seen 4 cases of frostbite in the past 10 days and treated 2 cases of what will probably become pneumonia by the end of the month. One of those is Patrick Halford." Dorothea looked at him. Dr. Greer said he's been working outside in this cold every day since the Brennan fire. His lungs were already weakened from the summer. "Kezia knows it's serious." He finished his coffee and stood up. Before he left, he looked at the kitchen floor at the braided rug over the trap door. He said, "How much do you have left?" Dorothea said 2.5 cords, more than we need for the winter. He said the Croft family will need somewhere to store wood if they're going to rebuild in the spring. The Jameson barn isn't going to hold them through February, and Clifton's supply is thin. Dorothea said, "Send them to me." Dr. Greer looked at her. "Just like that." Dorothea said, "Just like that." He nodded and went out into the cold. January 9th. The thermometer outside the Holsworth cabin read 31 below zero at noon. By 4 in the afternoon, it had dropped to 37. By the time Dorothea banked the fire for the night and checked the door seals and looked in on the children and came back to find Silas still sitting by the stove, it read 41. He said, "Go to sleep. I'll watch it." She said, "You need sleep more than I do." He said, "I've been sitting in chairs for 9 months. I think I can manage one more night." She looked at him for a moment, then she went to bed. She was asleep when the knock came. Silas heard it first. 2 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. He was at the door before the 3rd set. Clifton Jameson stood on the porch with snow on his shoulders and his hat in his hands. The cold behind him was a physical presence, not a temperature, but a substance, and it pushed into the room past Clifton's body and touched every surface. Silas said, "Come in." Clifton said, "Kane has a fever. It came on fast 2 hours ago. I can't get it down. Dr. Greer is in Stevensville. I can't reach him tonight, and I don't know what to do." Silas turned and said Dorothea's name once, not loudly. She was already in the doorway of the bedroom, her coat in her hands. She said to Silas, "Bank the fire higher before you follow." She said to Clifton, "Let's go." They went out into the 41 below zero night. The walk to the Jameson cabin was a 1/4 mile. Dorothea made it in 7 minutes with Clifton half a step behind her, and the cold worked at every exposed surface the whole way, finding the gap at her collar, finding the skin above her boot tops. She did not slow down. Kane was on his bed with 2 blankets over him and still shaking. His color was wrong, the particular grayish flush that meant the body was working very hard at something it was losing ground on. She pressed her hand to his forehead, then to the side of his neck, then took his wrist and counted. She said to Clifton, "How long has he been in the cold today?" Clifton said he went out twice to help with the Croft family's things. 3 hours total, maybe more. She said, "Where are the Crofts sleeping?" Clifton pointed toward the back room. She went and looked in. 5 people in a space meant for storage with a single small stove that was working at capacity. The air in the room was warm enough to survive in and cold enough to make the lungs work for it. She came back to Kane. She said, "I need your warmest blankets, a pot of water on the stove, and cloth I can wet. Everything else stay out of the room." Clifton said, "What is it?" She said his body is cold under the fever. He's been fighting the temperature for hours, and now he's fighting the fever on top of it. We treat them in order. She worked through the night. The techniques were her grandmother's, learned in a Pennsylvania kitchen during a winter when Dorothea was 11, and her brother ran the same kind of fever after 3 days in wet clothes. Her grandmother had moved through the sick room with the same economy of motion that Dorothea used now. No gesture wasted, everything directed toward the single objective of keeping the body's core temperature stable while the fever worked itself through. Silas arrived at the cabin an hour after Dorothea. He found Clifton sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup he had stopped drinking from. The 2 men sat together in the kitchen while the sounds of Dorothea working came from the back room. Clifton said, "I came to your place tonight because I didn't know where else to go." Silas said, "I know." Clifton said, "I've been wrong about a lot of things this year." Silas said, "You weren't wrong about everything. You were right that it was risky. It was risky." Clifton looked at him. Silas said she did it anyway, and she was right too. Clifton looked at his coffee cup. He said, "My boy came to her place all summer because he believed in what she was doing. I told him he was wrong. He said, I spent 6 months telling everyone in this valley that your wife's project was a mistake." He paused. "And then tonight when Kane got sick, the first place I thought of was Dorothea Holsworth." Silas did not say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. They sat together in the kitchen until the sky outside the window began to show the particular gray that was not yet dawn, but was no longer full dark. Kane's fever broke at 5:30 in the morning. Dorothea came out of the back room and washed her hands at the basin and accepted the coffee Clifton poured for her without speaking. She drank half of it standing up. Clifton said, "Thank you." She said he'll need 2 days of rest and then careful exposure to cold for a week before he does any outdoor work. Clifton said, "I understand." She picked up her coat. Silas stood up. Clifton looked at both of them. He said, "Mrs. Holsworth, I want you to know something." He paused. "I came here tonight because you were the most capable person I could think of. Not the closest, not the most convenient, the most capable." Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Make sure he drinks plenty of water today, and thank him for helping Kester with the wood hauling this summer." She went out the door. Silas followed. They walked home in the early morning cold, which had eased slightly to something in the mid-30s below. The sky was a deep, clear black in the west and a gray that was becoming blue in the east. Their breath came out in clouds that lasted in the still air for a moment before dissolving. Silas said, "You knew it was Kane," before Clifton said his name. Dorothea said, "I didn't know. I thought it might be." He said, "You went anyway." She said, "Of course." They walked the rest of the way home without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because the cold and the dark and the hour created a kind of quiet that was complete in itself, and neither of them wanted to disturb it. The worst cold of the winter held for another week after that night. The Clearwater Valley was a place of absolute stillness, every sound absorbed before it could travel, every tree motionless, every animal sheltered or dead. Dorothea brought up 6 pieces of wood each morning instead of 4, and the stove ran hot all day, and still the cabin's temperature dropped to 52 degrees in the late afternoon before stabilizing. 52 degrees was survivable. It was almost comfortable measured against what was happening outside. The third chimney fire in the valley happened in the deepest part of that cold. It was the Harrison place. Vera Harrison had been burning pine that had been stored outside since October because it was all they had. The creosote had been building for 3 months. The fire started in the flue at midnight and moved to the roof faster than a fire should move because the cold had dried every surface of that cabin to a brittleness that welcomed flame. They got out. All of them 3 children, and Vera and her husband Frank. They got out with coats and boots and the presence of mind to grab the cash box from the kitchen shelf. They stood in the yard and watched their cabin burn in deep cold, and the fire was the only warm thing for a mile in any direction. Frank Harrison said later that what he remembered most was the color of the flames against that particular quality of winter dark. The way it seemed almost beautiful. The way beauty and catastrophe occupied exactly the same space. They came to the Holsworth cabin before dawn. Dorothea opened the door before Frank finished knocking. She had heard them coming footsteps in packed snow, carried a long way in cold that's still and quiet. She said, "Come into all of them," and then she went to the trap door and brought up wood for the stove, and Silas heated water, and the Harrison children sat on the kitchen floor close to the stove, and Vera sat at the table and did not speak for a long time. After a while, Vera said, "I came to your door 2 months ago with Matilda Blackthorne, and I am ashamed of it." Dorothea said, "You told me you were sorry that day. I heard you." Vera said, "I said it quietly. It deserved to be said out loud." Dorothea put her hand briefly on Vera's and then went back to the stove. The Harrison family stayed 4 days. Frank spent part of each day outside with Silas, who was now moving well enough to work in moderate conditions, assessing what remained of the Harrison structure and what could be salvaged. The chimney was gone. The roof was gone. The walls were standing but compromised. In spring, there would be a decision to make. On the 4th day, Matilda Blackthorne's hired hand appeared at the Holsworth door with a folded note. Dorothea opened it and read it. Matilda's note said, "I have been told you assisted the Harrison family. I find myself in a position where I need to ask a direct question. Would you be willing to sell a portion of your stored wood at market rate? I am not without resources, but my supply is shorter than I planned for." Dorothea stood at this table and read the note twice. Then she sat down and wrote a reply on the back of it. She wrote, "I won't sell, but if you want to learn how to build what I built, I'll show you in the spring at no charge." She sent it back with the hired hand. Silas read her reply over her shoulder. He said nothing, but she felt him nod. 3 days later, Matilda came herself. She arrived in the mid-morning alone without the hired hand, and without Vera Harrison, and without any of the social architecture she had brought to her previous visit. She tied her horse at the post and knocked and came in when Dorothea opened the door, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at the braided rug on the floor, and at the kitchen table above it, and at the ordinary room that had kept this family alive through the worst winter in 6 years. She said, "I heard about Kane Jameson." Dorothea said he recovered well. Matilda said Clifton told half the valley about that night. She paused. He was not discreet about what he said. Dorothea said, "What did he say?" Matilda said that you walked a quarter mile in 41 below zero in the middle of the night because someone needed help, and that you were the most capable person he knew to call on. The room was quiet. Matilda said, "You are a strange woman, Dorothea Holsworth." Dorothea said, "I'm a practical one." Matilda looked at her. The expression on her face was not the composure of their previous meeting, carefully assembled and maintained. This was something different. Something that had been worked over by a winter that had not respected her resources or her position or the careful social order she had spent years arranging. She said, "When I came here in September, I thought I was protecting something important. The way things work, the way they should work." She paused. "I watched Frank Harrison's cabin burn from my upstairs window. I watched a woman I helped try to humiliate open her door to that family before they had finished knocking. And I thought about that for a while." Dorothea waited. Matilda said, "I would like to take you up on your offer. In the spring, I have clay on the north end of my property. Good clay, I think, from the way it holds after rain." Dorothea said, "I'll look at it in April." Matilda said, "I'll pay you for your time." Dorothea said, "You'll feed me lunch. That's enough." Matilda stood there a moment longer. Then she put on her hat and went out the door, and Dorothea watched her ride away down the snow-covered track toward the Blackthorne property 4 miles east. Silas came and stood beside her at the window. He said she didn't apologize. Dorothea said no. He said, "Does that bother you?" Dorothea thought about it honestly. She said she came here alone. She asked for help, and she accepted the terms I offered. For Matilda Blackthorne, that is an apology. February brought a slight warming, temperatures rising to single digits above zero for several days in a row. And in that relative thaw, Forrest Englehart made the ride from Missoula to the Holsworth property. He went through the trap door with his lantern and the moisture gauge, and he came back up with the number on the dial, 14%. And he set the gauge on the kitchen table and looked at Dorothea and said what he said, the 17 buildings and the most intelligent practical engineering, and offered the timber contract premium and left. After he was gone, Dorothea picked up the moisture gauge and turned it over in her hands. She had carried it in her apron pocket for 8 months. She set it on the kitchen windowsill next to the pottery fragment, the curved piece of reddish clay she had pulled from the ground in July. The two objects sat there together for the rest of the winter. She did not explain to anyone why she had placed them there. Some things arranged themselves into meaning without requiring commentary. March came and the cold broke the way coal breaks in Montana, not gradually but in stages. Each stage a negotiation between winter and the returning sun. The snow began to compact rather than powder. The creek, which had been silent under ice since November, made itself known again, first as a sound beneath the surface, and then as movement visible through the thinning ice sheet. Kezia Halford came in the first week of March with bread and news. Patrick's lungs had given him trouble through January and February, as Dr. Greer had predicted, but the worst seemed to have passed. He had lost weight. He was coughing less. Kezia thought he would be all right. She sat at the table and told Dorothea about their winter, honestly, the wet wood and the black smoke, and the nights when the cold came through the walls in a way that made her wonder whether the walls were actually containing anything at all. She said, "We made it, but I don't want another winter like that." Dorothea said, "Your soil. What does it look like under the topsoil on the north side of your property?" Kezia said, "I've never looked." Dorothea said, "In April, dig down 2 feet in 3 different spots and bring me what you find. If it's clay, we can start planting." Kezia looked at her, "Just like that." Dorothea said, "Just like that." Reverend Everhart came through on his circuit in late March, and Dorothea encountered him at the Stevensville trading post rather than at her door. He stood beside her at the counter and spoke without preamble, in the direct way of a man who had rehearsed the conversation and decided the only way through it was straight. He said, "Mrs. Holsworth, I owe you a correction. What I said about natural order in September was wrong. Not incomplete, wrong. I watched this valley struggle through a winter that your project handled without difficulty, and I spent some time thinking about why I worked so hard to argue against something that turned out to be simply good engineering and good sense." Dorothea looked at him. He said, "I think I was more comfortable with the order of things than I was with the evidence in front of me. That's a theological failure as much as a practical one." Dorothea said, "Thank you, Reverend." He said, "I don't suppose you'd be willing to speak to the circuit congregations about the project. There are families in the Flathead Valley who could use the information." Dorothea said she would consider it. He nodded and paid for his flour and went out. Dorothea watched him go and thought that an honest acknowledgement delivered at a trading post counter was worth more than any elaborate ceremony of apology, because it cost the person giving it exactly the right amount. Spring came to the Clearwater Valley the way it always came, with a determination that seemed almost argumentative after the severity of the winter that preceded it. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the flat ground, then from the north-facing hollows that held the cold longest. The creek ran full and fast with snowmelt. The birch trees at the property's edge put out their first pale leaves with the cautious optimism of things that have survived something difficult and are not yet entirely sure it is over. Dorothea spent 2 days in April walking the Blackthorn property, with Matilda testing soil in the systematic way her father had taught her, pressing a handful of damp earth and observing how it held its shape. The clay on the north end of the Blackthorn land was excellent, dense, and stable, better than the clay under the Holsworth cabin. Dorothea told her so without softening it, because the quality of the material was a practical fact, and Matilda Blackthorn deserved practical facts. They worked without much conversation, and what conversation they had was technical. Dorothea showed her how to assess pillar placement. Matilda asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a small leather notebook. At noon, Matilda's housekeeper brought food to the back porch, and they ate together without discussing anything that had happened between September and March, because neither of them needed to. Clifton Jameson's underground chamber took shape through May and June with Dorothea's consultation and Kane's considerable labor. The boy worked with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for permission to do something he already understood, and the chamber went up faster and cleaner than Dorothea's had, partly because they had better information, and partly because Kane Jameson had inherited his father's instinct for structural soundness, even if he had not inherited his resistance to new ideas. Clifton worked alongside his son through most of it. He was not a man given to elaborate statements, and he made none. But Dorothea noticed that when Kane solved a problem independently, when he figured out the drainage angle without being told, or worked out the ventilation shaft placement from first principles, Clifton would stop what he was doing and watch the boy for a moment with an expression that was entirely private and entirely clear. The summer of 1877 was a different kind of summer than the one that had preceded it. There were still long days of physical work, still the particular fatigue of frontier life that lived in the shoulders and hands. But the quality of the work had shifted. The projects that summer were building projects rather than survival projects. Silas moved well now. The leg had healed completely by spring, and he worked beside Dorothea with the easy coordination of two people who have learned each other's working rhythms over a long period. One evening in late June, after the children had eaten and gone outside to catch the last of the long summer light, Dorothea sat at the table and opened her father's second notebook to the page where she had written her own observations in the margins. She had been adding to it through the year, small notes in her handwriting alongside his larger diagrams, a record of what had worked and what had required adjustment, and what she had discovered that he had not anticipated. She turned to the page where she had found the folded note in July of the previous year. She took it out, she unfolded it, she read it. 4 words in her father's handwriting in the block letters he used when he wanted to be understood clearly, for Dorothea. Then below it a line she had been carrying unread for 14 months. The best engineering is the kind that knows its own limits. She sat with that for a while. Silas came in from outside and saw her sitting at the table with the notebook open and the slip of paper in her hand. He had seen her find it last summer. He had watched her fold it back up and put it away unread. He had not asked about it since. He sat down across from her. She slid the paper across the table to him. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and smoothed it with his thumb gently, the way you handle something that has been waiting a long time to be useful. He said he wrote this before he died. She said 4 years before. He put it in the notebook he knew I would need. Silas said he knew you would need reminding that limits exist. She said I think he knew I would forget it in the middle of something difficult and remember it when the difficult thing was over, which is when it's actually useful. Silas looked at the paper for another moment. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back to her. He said your father was a smart man. She said he was. She put the note back between the pages of the notebook. She closed it over the note and the summer observations and the diagrams and everything else it contained. Outside, Kester and Josie were running in the yard in the last horizontal light of a June evening, their voices coming in through the open window with the smell of cut grass and the sound of the creek running full somewhere below the tree line. The stove was cold. It would stay cold for months. The chamber under the floor was empty, drying out through the summer, waiting to be filled again in the fall. That was the work. Fill it, empty it, fill it again. Not once, but every year for as long as the family lived on this land and the winters came down from the north with their full weight and their absolute indifference to anything as small as a single family's plans. The Holsworth family proved up their homestead claim in 1881 and received title to their 160 acres. Silas worked timber contracts with Englehart until 1889. Kester studied civil engineering and built railroad grades across the Northern Territories. Josie taught school in Clearwater for 34 years. Dorothea lived until 1923. A local historian came to see her in her last decade, a young man from Missoula who was documenting the practical innovations of the homesteading period. He asked her about the underground storage chamber, which had become something of a regional legend by then. He asked if she considered it a significant achievement. She said it was a hole in the ground, a well-designed hole, but a hole. He said 30 families copied it within 4 years. She said they improved on it. The versions Clifton Jameson and Forrest Englehart helped build later in the decade were better than mine. Better drainage, better ventilation. That's how it's supposed to work. He asked, is there anything you would have done differently? She thought about it. She said I would have read my father's notes sooner. He left me something I needed, and I set it aside because I didn't want it to change my thinking while I was in the middle of deciding. That was stubborn. The historian said, but you succeeded. She said I did. She looked out the window for a moment. But there's a difference between succeeding and understanding what you did. The note would have helped me understand it while it was happening instead of after. He was telling me that the project had limits I needed to respect, and he was also telling me that I had limits, that both things were all right. The historian wrote that down. She said the frontier taught me that the question is never whether conditions are ideal. They never are. The question is whether what you have is enough. Enough material, enough knowledge, enough people who will stand beside you when the work gets hard. She paused. That winter I had enough, not more than enough, but enough. The historian thanked her and gathered his papers. She walked him to the door and stood in the doorway after he had gone down the path to his car. That modern intrusion into the landscape she had watched change over 47 years, from open frontier to something that almost resembled the places she had come from. Automobiles on the roads Silas had helped build. Electric lights coming to Stevensville. The old cabin long since replaced by a proper house with a proper foundation that went all the way into the ground. She did not know, standing in that doorway, that archaeologists would one day identify the faint outline of her original chamber in the soil, the support pillar positions preserved in the earth like a signature. She did not know her name would appear in a monograph about frontier engineering practices cited for practical innovation in adverse conditions. She would not have cared much about either of those things. What she knew was what she had always known. The work was the work. You paid attention to the ground beneath your feet, in the sky above your head, and the people standing beside you, and you made what you could from what you had. And if you were careful and stubborn and a little bit lucky, it held. It held through the winter of 1877. It held through everything after.